Morning, folks. I'm Dave Canterbury with Self-Reliance Outfitters and the Pathfinder School, back at it at the Pathfinder Outdoor Classroom. What I want to discuss with you today is what we call the Rapid Deployment Ridgeline and a couple of different options. And one thing that I just came up with myself that's going to blow your mind, that's completely different than what's normally done, but makes things much, much easier no matter what line loop you intend to use. When I mean line loop, I mean rope tackling loop. So let's first talk about that, okay? Now, let's talk about different loops real quick. First of all, there's the standard that we've always taught, which is basically a slip loop rope tackle. And you just flip an overhand loop in the line. So basically you just twist the line over itself, and then you walk that loop back up the line and pull it through, and that gives you a slip knot. So you're basically just turning it over, walking it up, pulling it through, and that gives you a slip knot. When you come around the other side, you put your line through that slip knot and you pull it down tight, and that's your tackling device to get a tight ridge line. Then you would pinch that off and hold it and tie a slippery half hitch in there, okay? Which basically just means you're tying a half hitch in this line over the top and through that loop, and you're pulling it down. Now, this is the improvement I want to show you in a minute that's going to blow your mind. But let's talk about the tackle loops first, okay? When we're done with this, we need to pull this out, and we need to pull this out. The problem is that this fixed loop gets put under great strain when you're using it as a tackling device. And when you pull it apart, sometimes you have to pull against a fixed object just to pop it out. And it puts a lot of stress on the cordage in that one area because you've got a lot of heat friction from pulling that knot back through itself. Now, the improvement I showed last week to that situation from Outdoor Academy Australia was to come around to this line and basically cross the lines over. And you can do that just by putting it on top of your hand and going across, and that's going to cross this line over this one. And once you cross that line over the top, all you're going to do is pull that line that's underneath that you've crossed. So let's just throw this all the way across for sake of purpose for right now. So we've got it on the other side. So we've got these lines crossed. And now we're going to take this loop and pull it over the crossed line like this. Now you're already creating that rope tackle right here. And you've got this loop that you've pulled through here on the opposite side. And what you do with that is you're going to take that loop and you're going to take an underhand turn in the line. Instead of an overhand turn, it's an underhand turn. And you're going to put that loop through that underhand turn to create a partial sheep shank in the line. And in Australia, they call this a truckie's hitch. It's not a true trucker's hitch. A lot of people made comments on this and said, oh, that's just a trucker's hitch. It's really not. A true trucker's hitch employs a fixed inline loop. Most of the time, that's either a directional figure of 8 or an alpine butterfly, but it is a fixed loop in the line. This is a variation of what's called a bell ringer's knot, which would have a tie off on this side, and this would be double looped around. We've single looped it around more like a sheep shank on this side, and then we're using that to pull against, and again, the same slippery half hitch, okay? Now, during all of this, you can also think about when we create this rapid deployment ridgeline. I saw Sean Kelly, Corporal's Corner, just did a video on this yesterday, developing this rapid deployment ridgeline. And he used this slip loop as his rope tackle. Nothing wrong with that. In my opinion, it's just not the best anymore. I used to think it was, I don't anymore. If you're going to put prusik loops on your line anyway, and you're adding 2 of these for the corners of your tarp, why not just use a third one on there and use that for your rope tackle? Then you don't have to tie anything in the line whatsoever, and you've already got a loop that you can draw tension against. So that's another option. You could put 3 of these prusik loops on there and avoid tying any knots or messing around with this rope at all, and just drop your rope through that loop and go with it. That's probably the simplest and fastest possible way to do it. Now what I want to show you is something that is kind of a contradiction to what the guy said at Australia Academy Outdoors. Hope I'm getting that right. Australia Outdoor Academy. one of the things that he said, the reason he likes this other loop, and I'll talk about that again really fast. The reason he liked this, what he called a truckie's hitch, when you pull that loop through and you get that underhand loop that you tie around it, what that does is it puts this line that you're going to tie that half hitch in inside all of this loop, so that when it comes undone, you don't ever have to pull the line again through any loops, okay? It all just comes undone and falls apart, and you don't have to fish all of your line through that fixed loop. Now, what I discovered is there's a way to do this and never fish the line through a fixed loop, whether it's a prusik loop, whether it is a slip loop, whether it's some other loop you've put in the line to use it as a tensioning device. You can tie a slippery half hitch in this and have the line always on the outside and never through the loop. That's what I want to show you today. So what we did, I'm going to go ahead and use the first one first. I'm going to use the slip loop, okay, for this. So if I tie that slip loop in, and again, all I'm doing is here, twisting it over and going up the line and pulling it through, just like this. That's made a slip loop in the line that will lock down. Generally, you would take this line through the loop. And that was the big heartache from my buddy there in Australia, was that you had to pull all this line through the loop, and that may cause you a headache if you have a long length of line. I'm gonna show you a way you don't have to do that. So what I'm gonna do now, instead of fishing all of my line through this loop, I'm only gonna pull a bite through this loop. And I'm gonna use that bite to pull this tight. And then instead of trying to mess around with tying that bite into a slippery half hitch, I'm gonna use that bite as my slippery half hitch. I'm gonna take this tail that's hanging down here that would reduce the size of that loop, and I'm going to pull it through that loop just like this. So I've opened up that loop, I've got that tail and I pull it through. Now I've created a slippery half hitch around the loop. And now I can actually pull on this and it will tighten the line. I can pull on this loop and tighten the line to get it as tight as I possibly want it. Then I can go ahead and reduce the size of this loop if I want to. But now I have a slippery half hitch that when I pull it out of this thing, everything just came out. It's gone, right? I didn't have to pull anything through the line. So I made my loop, all right? And this time what we're gonna do is we're gonna go with this loop, okay? So I come through here and I've got my prusik loop on the line. Instead of taking all of my line through the prusik, I only pull a bite of line through and I push it fairly tight. Then I just pinch it off and I take this hanging line and I pull it through the loop like this, but I don't pull it all the way through. I only pull it through enough to draw down on it like this to create another slippery half hitch right here. And now I can pull on this and everything will tighten up and it will stay. And all I have to do to get it undone is pull this. So the advantage to that is if I've got somebody who's weaker that can't necessarily pinch these lines and hold them together and all that stuff, instead of doing that double wrap inside the loop and putting even more stress from friction on the cordage, all I'm really doing is I'm coming through here with a bite and I'm using that bite in the line right there as my slippery half hitch by pulling a bite through it. Now I'm fairly loose, but I can now take this and pull on it and tighten everything up. Now my line's rock solid. And when I want it out, instead of having to pull out the knot and then pull everything through my fixed loop, all I have to do is pull it out and it all comes out of the line all by itself and there's nothing there but my fixed loop. Now, if I used a prusik, then it would still be on the line. If I used a overhand slip loop, then I would have to pop it out of the line. To me, the perfect combination of everything is to have that prusik loop on there already. Use that prusik loop and put a bite through it. Tie it partially tight. Again, I've just got the lines loose here. I'm just pulling back and pinching it. It doesn't have to even be tight when I pinch it necessarily. Just got to be drawn taut, okay? Pinch it down. I'm just going to reduce the size of this loop so you can see it. This is my loop of bite that I pulled through there. I'm just going to pull this through in a bite to create a half hitch there. And when I do that, I can draw down on that half hitch and that's going to tighten my line. So I've got a big loop I can yank on to tighten my line. I don't have to try to trap anything or catch anything. And when I pull all of this out, all of it comes out of the line. Nothing has to be pulled back through the loop. So doing this research on something as simple as a rapid deployment ridgeline and figuring out different ways of doing it, looking at the way people do it, and figuring out what's the fastest, easiest, most effective way to get the job done is really the key to what I would say the Pathfinder system. I want it repeatable. I want anybody to be able to learn it, and I want it to be able to be done fast and quick and not put too much undue wear on the equipment that I'm using, because the rapid deployment ridgeline is something I'm going to use over and over. It's not an expendable item.